Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. It started with a turn that felt right at the time. Not careless, not rushed, just familiar enough to trust, the kind of turn you make because you've made it before or something like it. And your body recognizes the motion even if your mind isn't fully paying attention. The street was quiet. Late enough that most storefronts were dark, early enough that a few lights were still on behind curtains. The air carried the faint smell of asphalt cooling down after a warm day. Walking alone, there was no hurry, no destination that needed to be reached by a certain time. Just movement steady and unremarkable meant to clear the head after a long stretch of thinking. A few blocks in, something felt off. Not wrong exactly, just unfamiliar. The houses didn't line up the way they were supposed to. The streetlights seemed spaced differently. The rhythm of the walk changed subtle at first, like a song playing slightly out of tempo. The phone stayed in the pocket, not out of principle, just because it hadn't occurred to reach for it yet. Another block passed, then another. That was when the realization settled in. This wasn't the way back. The feeling that followed wasn't panic. It was something quieter and more unsettling. A soft tightening in the chest, a pause in the step. The sense of standing in a place that didn't match the map in the mind. Fear arrived gently. Where am I? How did I miss it? There was an urge to turn around immediately, to retrace steps, to undo the mistake before it became more complicated. Going back felt safer than moving forward into something unknown. But standing there, it wasn't clear which direction was back anymore. The street looked the same in both directions, quiet, still, neutral. That neutrality made the fear louder. Without clear signals, the mind rushed to fill the gap. What if this keeps getting worse? What if this takes longer than expected? What if this is a sign of something deeper being off track? The body noticed its own reaction. The shoulders had crept up. The breath had shortened. The step had stopped altogether. Nothing in the environment suggested danger. No raised voices, no sudden movement, just a neighborhood at rest. And yet the feeling of being lost made everything feel sharper. The mind wanted a solution, a route, a clear answer that could be followed without question. It wanted the certainty of a line on a screen. Instead, there was only choice. The decision not to pull out the phone came quietly, not as a rule, more as curiosity, a wondering about what would happen if the moment was met directly without immediately fixing it. Standing still, the body let the breath drop lower. The ground underfoot felt solid. The night air moved across skin, cool and steady. Lost didn't mean unsafe. It just meant undefined. That distinction took a moment to land. Looking around more carefully, small details came into focus. A porch light left on. A bicycle leaned against a fence. Wind moving through trees at the end of the block. Life was happening here too. Being lost had narrowed attention at first, but now it began to widen it. Without a known path, awareness had to stay closer to what was actually present. A step forward felt tentative, then another. Not chosen because it was correct, but because standing still had started to feel heavier than moving. Each step brought new information. A cross street, a familiar sound of traffic farther away, a shift in the way the air felt. The fear of being lost didn't disappear. It stayed nearby, alert, watching for signs of danger. But it stopped leading. The body was moving again, and movement brought orientation even without a map. The path wasn't clear yet. The destination still felt far. But something had changed. The situation no longer felt like a mistake that needed to be erased. It felt like a moment that needed to be navigated. Lost didn't have to mean wrong. It could mean early. That thought didn't solve anything, but it softened the urgency. Another block passed, then another. The night remained quiet. The neighborhood unfolded without resistance. And slowly, almost without noticing, a sense of direction began to return. Not because the right street had appeared, but because trust in the ability to find one had. The body relaxed just a little. The breath lengthened. Being lost hadn't ended yet, but it no longer felt like the opposite of progress. It felt like the beginning of a different kind of search. The feeling of being lost didn't disappear all at once. It loosened the way a knot does when you stop pulling at it. Walking continued slower now, not because of caution, but because there was no need to rush. Each step landed with more awareness. The sound of shoes on pavement, the faint echo of movement between houses, the quiet certainty that the ground was still doing its job. Fear stayed nearby, but it changed tone. Earlier, it had been sharp, insistent. Now it felt more like a question than a warning. Where am I really going? That question felt different from the one that had come before. It wasn't asking for directions. It wasn't asking to be solved. It was simply noticing that the old certainty had slipped away. Another intersection appeared. This one looked slightly more familiar. Not enough to recognize, but enough to feel less foreign. A street sign reflected a bit of light. The name meant nothing at first, then stirred something faint. The body didn't latch onto it. It kept moving. There was a strange freedom in that. When the correct route is unknown, every step becomes provisional. Nothing has to be perfect. Nothing has to match an expectation. The mind noticed how often it confuses knowing with safety, as if having a clear plan guarantees a smooth outcome. But being lost had already shown something else. That attention sharpens when certainty fades, that the body becomes more responsive, more alive, when it can't rely on habit. A car passed at the end of the block. Its headlights swept briefly across the street, then vanished. The sound lingered, a reminder that larger roads existed nearby. That felt reassuring. Lost didn't mean isolated. It meant temporarily unanchored. As the walk continued, the fear of having made a wrong turn softened further. There was no evidence of danger, no indication that this path was a mistake. It was simply unfamiliar. Unfamiliar places often feel threatening, not because they are unsafe, but because they don't confirm who we think we are. They don't mirror our usual patterns back to us. Being lost stripped away that mirror. Without the usual markers, there was nothing to measure progress against. No internal checklist, no timeline, just movement and response. The body began to enjoy that, even if it didn't fully trust it yet. Another street opened up ahead, wider this time. The sound of traffic grew clearer. The air felt different, less still. The city's larger rhythm made itself known again. Recognition arrived quietly, not as relief, but as orientation. The fear that had been so loud earlier had little to say now. It had done its job, alerted heightened awareness, and stepped back. Standing for a moment at the corner, it became clear that being lost hadn't been a detour from the journey. It had been part of it. A stretch where attention had been pulled out of autopilot and into the present. Losing the way hadn't erased direction. It had reset it. The body turned toward the sound of traffic. The step felt natural, unforced. The path forward didn't need to be confirmed. It only needed to be taken. Later at home, the experience lingered in small ways. In the pause before turning on lights, in the choice to move more slowly through familiar rooms, in the awareness that orientation doesn't come from memorizing routes, but from responding to what's actually here. Fear had insisted that being lost meant failure, that it was evidence of distraction or poor judgment. But the night had shown something else. Sometimes you lose the path because the path you were on has nothing new to offer. Sometimes you need to not know for a while so you can notice what you've been missing. The body rested with that understanding, not as a conclusion, but as a gentle shift in perspective. There would be other moments of losing direction, other times when certainty slipped away, But now there was a memory to return to, a reminder that not knowing doesn't mean you're off course. It might mean you're just beginning to see the terrain differently. The night ended without ceremony. Sleep arrived without needing to make sense of the walk. And somewhere beneath the quiet, there was trust. Not in a map, not in a plan, but in the simple fact that even when the way is unclear, the ability to find one remains. That was enough. It's easy to believe the problem is out there. A person, a comment, a situation that shouldn't have happened the way it did. Something visible, concrete, easy to point at. That belief had been carrying a lot of weight lately. The room was quiet, lit only by the glow of a desk lamp. Papers were spread out untouched. A laptop sat open, but idle, the screen dimming as minutes passed without input. Nothing was actively wrong in that moment. And yet the body felt tense, alert, like it was waiting for another hit. The anger had been justified earlier. A disagreement. A misunderstanding that felt one-sided. A moment where being calm had felt like losing. That was the story, at least. Sitting there now, the mind replayed the exchange again, but something felt off. The heat that had been there earlier wasn't aimed anywhere specific anymore. It just hovered. The enemy was nowhere in the room, and yet the body stayed braced. The jaw was tight. The breath shallow. One foot tapped against the floor without realizing it. Anger often claims to be a response, but sometimes it keeps going long after the stimulus has left. The mind searched for something to blame. It brought up faces, phrases, imagined conversations, but none of them fully explained why the chest still felt tight. There was a pause, not intentional, just a gap where the usual replay didn't quite start. In that pause, a strange realization slipped in. The argument was over. The person wasn't here. The situation had passed. But the anger hadn't gotten the message. It was like fighting someone who had already left the building. The thought was unsettling. Because if the enemy wasn't present anymore, then what was being defended against? The chair creaked as weight shifted. The lamp hummed faintly. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. The body didn't respond to them as safe. That's when it became clearer the tension wasn't about the other person anymore. It was about the state the body had learned to stay in. Anger can turn into a habit, not a feeling that comes and goes, but a posture, a readiness, a stance that says, stay sharp. Don't relax. You might need this. The mind resisted that idea immediately. I'm not angry, I'm just aware. I'm not holding on to anything, I'm just prepared. Prepared for what? The room offered no answer. The invisible enemy had no face, no voice, no clear demands. It was just there, shaping the body's reactions without asking permission. There was a memory of another time when anger had been clearly directed. Years ago. A confrontation that had felt necessary. The outcome hadn't been great, but at least it had been clear who was on the other side. This was different. This anger didn't need a person. It fed on anticipation, on the belief that something might happen again. The laptop screen went dark completely. The room dimmed further. The lamp became the main source of light. The body finally noticed how tired it felt. Not tired from doing too much, but tired from staying ready. Anger as defense takes energy. It keeps the nervous system in a constant state of readiness. Over time, that readiness becomes exhausting. The thought came quietly. What if the enemy I'm fighting isn't them anymore? It didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like an admission. The tension in the body wasn't protecting anything at this point. It wasn't preventing harm. It was just continuing itself. Like a guard who never got the signal that the threat was gone. The breath slowed slightly. Not by effort, by recognition. If the enemy was no longer external, then fighting harder wouldn't help. The real struggle was internal now. The mind didn't like that. It wanted something tangible, something to push against. But the room stayed still, silent, unthreatening. The invisible enemy didn't move either. It just waited. The room didn't change. The light stayed the same. The desk stayed cluttered. The silence stayed quiet. What changed was attention. For the first time that evening, the focus shifted away from the story and toward the body itself. The tight jaw, the lifted shoulders, the way the breath seemed to stop halfway in, as if waiting for permission to finish. Nothing was happening. That was the strange part. No new message, no footsteps outside, no raised voices, no incoming threat. And yet the body was still acting as if something needed to be defended. That's when it became undeniable the anger was no longer reacting. It was running on its own. Like a machine left on after the room emptied. The mind tried to argue. Staying alert is smart, relaxing is how you get hurt again. But the body didn't feel smart, it felt tired. There was a memory of setting down a heavy bag after carrying it for too long. That brief moment when the arms feel oddly light, almost unsteady, unsure what to do without the weight. That's what this felt like, standing at the edge of putting something down without knowing how. The invisible enemy had been useful once. It had helped draw boundaries. It had given energy when something felt unfair. It had protected dignity in moments that mattered. But now it was guarding an empty room. The realization didn't come with relief. It came with hesitation. Because if the anger wasn't needed anymore, then who was in charge? Anger had been doing the watching, the scanning, the remembering. Letting it go felt like stepping away from the post. The breath deepened slightly, then stopped again, then continued. It wasn't about forcing calm. It was about noticing how much effort had been going into staying tense. The laptop was closed, not with frustration, just gently. The click sounded final in a way that didn't feel dramatic. The chair was pushed back. Standing up felt unfamiliar, like the body was relearning a posture that didn't involve bracing. There was a brief moment of fear then, quiet but clear. If I stop being angry, what happens if it happens again? The answer didn't come from the mind. It came from the body's experience. Then I'll respond then. Anger had been living in the future, rehearsing a defense for something that wasn't happening right now. Forgiveness in this moment didn't mean excusing anyone. It meant releasing the body from a job it no longer needed to do. The shoulders dropped slightly. The jaw loosened. Not all at once, not completely, just enough to notice the difference. It became clear that the real enemy hadn't been the person from earlier, or the words that were said, or the situation that sparked everything. The real enemy had been the belief that the anger needed to stay awake forever. That belief had been shaping nights, coloring thoughts, stealing rest. And it didn't have to. The room felt different now. Not safer, just quieter, less charged. The invisible enemy didn't fight back. It didn't protest. It simply faded when it wasn't given attention. Not gone, just not in control. The body moved toward the window. Outside, the streetlight cast a soft pool of light on the sidewalk. Empty. Still. Nothing to defend against. The breath found a slower rhythm. The mind wandered without grabbing onto anything sharp. This wasn't victory. It wasn't peace. It was truce. A temporary ceasefire with a part of the self that had been working too hard for too long. The night continued without instruction, without vigilance. And for the first time in a while, there was no enemy to face. Just a body learning how to stand down. They noticed it while walking along the water. Not the scenery, not the light, just the feeling under their feet, the uneven ground. Small stones shifting slightly with each step, never quite settling where you expect them to. The path followed the edge of a quiet pond, the kind tucked behind apartment buildings or office parks. Nothing dramatic, no signs pointing it out. Just water trees and a thin strip of land people used when they wanted to think without being interrupted. They walked slowly, hands loose at their sides, letting the rhythm of their steps match the sounds around them. Water lapped gently against the bank. Somewhere nearby, a bird moved through the brush, then went still again. It had been a long few years. Not long in the way that comes with constant crisis, but long in the way that comes with pressure that never quite lifts. Responsibilities stacking, expectations accumulating. Moments where they told themselves to push through just a little longer. They had learned how to be tough. Not loud tough, quiet tough. The kind that doesn't complain, the kind that absorbs impact and keeps going. The kind that people admire without realizing what it costs. At first, that strength felt like armor. It protected them, helped them survive, gave them something solid to lean on when things felt uncertain. But over time, the armor hardened. They found themselves reacting faster, less patient, less flexible. Certain things rubbed them the wrong way more easily than before. Small frustrations lingered longer than they used to. They hadn't become bitter. They had become rigid. They stopped near the water and crouched down, resting their forearms on their knees. The surface of the pond reflected the sky in broken pieces, rippling with every small movement. Along the edge, stones of all shapes and sizes lined the bank. One caught their eye. A small pebble, light gray, smooth to the touch. No sharp edges, no corners. It fit easily in the palm of their hand. They picked it up and turned it over slowly. This stone hadn't always been like this. Once it had edges, angles, resistance. It had been part of something larger, something solid. Over time, water had met it again and again, wearing it down, not through force, but through consistency. The pebble didn't look damaged, it looked complete. They thought about how often they had judged themselves for feeling worn, for not having the same sharpness they once did, for being slower to react, for needing more rest than before. They'd told themselves they were losing something. But holding the pebble now, they wondered if that was true. What if what I'm losing is what no longer serves me? They rolled the pebble between their fingers. It felt grounding, familiar, like something they had known for a long time without being able to name. Life had sanded them down, not gently, not all at once, but steadily, through disappointment, through repetition, through showing up on days when they didn't feel inspired or strong. Each moment had left its mark, not as damage, as shaping. They had learned when to bend instead of break, when to let things pass instead of pushing back, when to stay still and when to move away. Those weren't losses, they were skills. They dropped the pebble back onto the bank and watched it settle among the others, indistinguishable at first glance, yet entirely itself. The pond continued its quiet movement. The water didn't judge the stones, didn't favor the sharp ones or the smooth ones. It touched them all the same again and again, shaping without intention. They stood and brushed their hands together, feeling the grit fall away. Their body felt heavier than it used to, but also more grounded, less reactive, more present. They had been through a lot. That didn't make them broken, it made them shaped. They took one last look at the water before continuing down the path. The sound followed them for a while, steady and soft, like a reminder that change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply leaves you smoother than before. They continued along the path, the pond staying beside them like a quiet companion. The water reflected less sky now, more shadow, as evening settled in. The world felt slower, as if everything had agreed to lower its voice at the same time. With each step, they became more aware of their body. The slight stiffness in the knees, the way their shoulders naturally rounded forward when they were tired. These weren't signs of weakness anymore. They were signals, information earned through time. Once they would have ignored them. Once they would have pushed through, proud of their ability to endure. Proud of being the one who didn't need breaks, didn't ask for help, didn't show where. That pride had served them. It had carried them through difficult years. But it had also taught them to resist softness. They remembered a version of themselves from long ago, quick to react, sharp in conversation, certain in their opinions. That person had felt powerful, unmovable, like a rock that nothing could touch. But rocks that never change eventually crack. The pebble by the water hadn't cracked. It had changed shape. They slowed and rested one hand against the railing near the path, feeling the cool metal under their palm. The contact was grounding, real, A reminder that support doesn't have to be dramatic to be effective. They thought about the times life had worn them down in ways they hadn't chosen. Losses that reshaped priorities, responsibilities that narrowed choices, repeated disappointments that softened expectations. Each one had felt like erosion, but erosion hadn't taken everything. It had taken what couldn't last. It had smoothed the sharp reactions, rounded the rigid beliefs, quieted the need to always be right. What remained felt steadier. They realized that being smooth didn't mean being empty. It meant being able to move without cutting themselves on their own edges. It meant fitting into places they once resisted. It meant being touched by life without being damaged by it. They stopped again and looked out across the pond. The surface was calm now, only faint ripples marking where something had passed through. They didn't need to go back to who they were before. That version had done its work. The person they were now carried more patience, more tolerance for uncertainty, a deeper understanding of what mattered and what didn't. Those qualities hadn't come from avoiding hardship. They had come from being shaped by it. They took a slow breath and let it out fully, feeling the tension leave their chest in small increments. The night air felt cooler against their skin, refreshing rather than biting. They started walking again, steps steady, unhurried. They no longer felt the need to defend themselves against the world. They didn't need to be as sharp as they once were to feel safe. They trusted their ability to adapt, to respond, to endure without hardening. Like the pebble, they had learned how to stay whole while changing. And as the path curved away from the water, they carried that knowledge with them, not as a lesson, not as a victory, just as a quiet truth. They hadn't been worn down. They had been shaped into something that could last. The blade looked sharp. At least that's how it appeared beneath the surface of the water, long, clean, perfectly defined. It shimmered slightly as the water moved, catching light in a way that made it seem even more precise, more dangerous than it actually was. But it wasn't a blade at all. It was just a reflection. The person noticed it while standing over the bathtub, waiting for the water to warm. Steam curled slowly upward, softening the edges of the room. The light above the mirror was dim, more yellow than white, turning everything gentler than it would be during the day. The reflection wavered as a drop of water fell from the faucet. The blade bent, fractured, then reformed. Still sharp, still convincing. There was a familiar feeling in the chest, tight, alert. The kind of reaction that happens before thought. As if something dangerous had just appeared. Then the person smiled quietly, almost embarrassed. It wasn't real. That realization came easily here, because the eyes could see it clearly. The mind didn't need to argue. The danger dissolved the moment it was recognized as a trick of light and water. Not all illusions were so easy. Earlier in the evening, there had been a thought, just one, that had landed hard. A memory of something said long ago. A sentence replayed with perfect clarity. Each word sharp, each tone precise. The mind had carried it around like a weapon, turning it over, feeling its edge. That thought had cut deep. Or at least it felt like it had. The body had reacted the same way it always did. Shoulders tightened, jaw set, breath shortened. The nervous system didn't pause to ask whether the danger was real. It only knew the sensation of threat. Standing there now, watching the false blade ripple in the water, something clicked. Thoughts can feel sharp without being able to cut. The water continued to move. The reflection shimmered again, dramatic and convincing. If you didn't know better, you might flinch. You might pull your hand back. You might treat the illusion like a real threat. The mind often does exactly that. It treats imagined harm like physical danger. It responds to words, memories, and predictions as if they could wound the present moment. It braces, it prepares, it tightens around the idea of being hurt again. The person reached a hand into the tub, disturbing the surface. The reflection shattered instantly, breaking into harmless fragments of light. No resistance, no injury, just water responding to touch. The blade was gone. The water felt warm now. The steam thickened, the room filled with quiet. The memory from earlier returned uninvited, but familiar. The same sentence, the same imagined tone, the same sharpness. It appeared fully formed, as if trying to prove it was real. The body noticed the reaction before the story took over. The chest tightened. The stomach clenched slightly. The breath caught. There it is again. The person didn't push the thought away, didn't argue with it, didn't try to replace it with something positive. They just noticed the sensation of sharpness, the edge, the feeling of being cut. And then they noticed something else. There was no wound, no blood, no damage, no new injury happening now. The pain was remembered, replayed, reflected, just like the blade in the water. This didn't mean the original experience hadn't mattered. Words can hurt. Moments can leave marks. But remembering a cut isn't the same as being cut again. The nervous system, however, doesn't always know that difference. It reacts to memory the same way it reacts to danger, unless something interrupts the pattern. The water reached its level. The faucet was turned off. Silence returned, thick and gentle. The person sat on the edge of the tub, letting the steam wrap around them. The mirror fogged slowly. The sharpness of the reflection, real or imagined, lost its clarity. Another thought appeared softer than the last. What if this thought can't actually hurt me anymore? The mind hesitated. It didn't fully agree, but it didn't reject the idea either. The body exhaled long and slow without instruction. The shoulders dropped. The jaw unclenched. The thought remained, but its edge dulled, like a sword underwater, still visible, still shaped like danger, but unable to leave a scar. The person watched the water settle the surface, smoothing itself without effort. The illusion did not return. And for the first time that evening, the memory loosened its grip, not because it had been defeated, but because it had been seen for what it was. A reflection, not a blade. The water settled into stillness. Steam continued to rise, but the surface itself grew calm, smooth enough to reflect the light again. This time, though, There was no blade, just a soft shimmer, vague and harmless. The illusion had lost its shape. The person stayed seated on the edge of the tub, longer than necessary, hands resting loosely on their knees. The warmth reached the skin, seeped into muscle, loosened places that had been tight without being noticed. The room felt smaller in a good way, contained safe ordinary. The memory returned again, as memories do. Same words, same voice, same moment in time. But something was different now. The thought arrived without the same jolt. The body noticed it, registered a faint echo of tension, then realized there was nothing to brace against. No impact followed. No new pain landed. It felt like holding a prop sword on a stage set, convincing from a distance, weightless up close. This was subtle work, easy to miss. The mind liked clearer victories, sharper conclusions. But this shift didn't announce itself. It happened quietly in the space between noticing and reacting. The person leaned back slightly, letting the palms press into the cool porcelain. The contrast with the warm air was grounding. Real. Present. Not a memory. Thoughts continued to pass through awareness, some sharp, some dull, some barely formed. But they moved differently now. They came and went, instead of circling like ripples, spreading out instead of cutting in. There was an understanding forming, not as an idea, but as a felt truth. Thoughts don't wound on their own. They only hurt when they're mistaken for weapons. The mind had spent years treating certain memories like blades, dangerous, loaded, capable of causing harm just by appearing. It had learned to flinch, to tighten, to defend. Those reactions had once made sense. They had protected something tender. But protection can turn into habit, and habit can outlive the danger it was built for. The person thought of all the times they'd replayed old moments, sharpening them with attention, adding meaning, adding weight. Each replay had remembered the pain, but forgotten the context, forgotten that the moment was over, forgotten that the cut had already healed. The water lapped gently against the sides of the tub as the person shifted position. The sound was soft, rhythmic, unthreatening. Another thought surfaced. If this can't cut me now, I don't have to fight it. That felt important. Not fighting didn't mean approving. It didn't mean agreeing with what had been said or done in the past. It just meant recognizing that the danger had passed, that the blade was no longer in motion, that what remained was a reflection visible, but not lethal. The person stood up slowly and tested the water with a foot. Warm, steady, safe. They stepped in and lowered themselves into the tub, letting the water rise around them. As the body settled, the thoughts continued to soften. Not disappear, soften. Their edges blurred like ink left in the rain. The mind noticed the sensation of water on skin, the rise and fall of breath, the sound of air moving through steam. Attention had somewhere else to rest now. There was no effort to push the memory away, no attempt to replace it with something better. It simply drifted to the side, no longer center stage. The sword stayed in the water only as long as it was believed to be sharp. Once seen clearly, it had nothing left to do. The person leaned their head back against the tub and closed their eyes. muscles relaxed fully now. The nervous system, no longer bracing for an invisible strike, began to stand down. The moment felt complete without needing to be explained. Not every painful thought needs to be solved. Not every memory needs to be healed tonight. Some only need to be seen accurately, as reflections, as echoes, as shapes that look dangerous but can't actually wound the present. The water held the body gently. The room stayed quiet. The night moved on without interference. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the mind stopped sharpening old blades. It let them rest in the water, harmless, still, unable to leave a scar. It didn't arrive as sadness. It arrived as nothing. The room had been tidied slowly without a plan. Not cleaning exactly, just putting things back where they belonged. Or maybe where they no longer needed to be. A shelf stood half empty now. A few objects remained spaced farther apart than before. The absence between them felt louder than the objects themselves. At first, the emptiness was uncomfortable. The eye kept returning to it like something unfinished. The instinct was to fill it. To put something there, anything just to stop the feeling of lack. The body stood still, hands resting at the sides. The lamp nearby cast a soft, warm light that made the shadows longer. The clock on the wall ticked steady and unconcerned. Nothing was wrong. And that was the problem. Fear doesn't always need a trigger. Sometimes it appears when there's too much space. When there's nothing demanding attention, nothing pulling the mind in a familiar direction. The thought crept in quietly. What now? The question wasn't urgent, but it carried weight. Without the usual noise, tasks, worries, plans, the emptiness felt exposed, like standing in an open field after years of moving through narrow hallways. The shelf remained half empty. The room didn't rush to resolve it. Sitting down, the body felt the chair support its weight immediately. No effort required. The breath moved in and out, simple and unremarkable. The kind of breathing that doesn't try to achieve anything. Fear tried again gently. If nothing is here, something must be missing. But looking closer, it became clear that nothing was actually gone. The room still existed. The body still sat. The night still held everything in place. The emptiness wasn't a hole. It was space. Space that hadn't yet been claimed by a story. That realization didn't bring comfort right away. It brought uncertainty. Because stories give shape. They explain why things are the way they are. Without one, the mind felt unanchored. The shelf had once been crowded, objects pressed together, each one claiming its spot. There had been no room for anything new or nothing at all. Now there was room. Fear circled that idea. Room for what? It wanted an answer, a plan, a direction. But the room didn't offer one. The light shifted slightly as a cloud passed outside. The shadow on the wall softened, then returned. The clock continued counting seconds that didn't ask to be filled. Sitting there, it became noticeable how much effort goes into avoiding emptiness. Filling calendars, filling conversations, filling silence with sound, as if space itself were dangerous. But this space wasn't doing anything. It wasn't pulling. It wasn't collapsing. It was simply there. The body noticed a subtle response. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The jaw unclenched. The breath lengthened without instruction. Emptiness, it turned out, didn't demand anything. It didn't ask to be understood. It didn't require a solution. It just waited. The shelf remained unfinished, and that felt intentional now. Not neglect, not indecision, just allowance. Allowance for not knowing what comes next. Allowance for not rushing to replace what was cleared. Fear had assumed that emptiness meant loss, that without structure everything would fall apart. But sitting in the quiet room, nothing was falling. The room felt larger. The body felt lighter. The absence on the shelf wasn't absence anymore. It was possibility unformed and unnamed. Not because something new was guaranteed to arrive, but because nothing was blocking it if it did. The thought came softly. Potential doesn't announce itself. It waits for space. That idea didn't need to be held on to. It drifted through like everything else. The lamp hummed faintly. The night deepened outside. The shelf stayed as it was. There was no rush to decide what belonged there, no urgency to define the emptiness. For now it was enough to sit with it, to let the space be space. Nothing needed to be added. Nothing needed to be removed. And in that quiet balance, the fear of emptiness loosened its grip just enough to reveal something unexpected beneath it. Not lack, but openness. Later, the emptiness stayed. It didn't fade the way other feelings did. It didn't demand attention. It simply remained steady and quiet, like a room after everyone has gone home. The body moved through the space differently now, slower, less directed. There was no sense of needing to do anything with the openness. It wasn't a task. It wasn't a problem. Fear tried to return, but it had less to work with. There was nothing obviously wrong, nothing missing, nothing pressing. Sitting again, the eyes drifted to the half-empty shelf. The space between objects no longer felt awkward. It felt intentional, as if it had always been meant to be there. The mind noticed how often it equates fullness with safety. A packed schedule, a crowded shelf, a constant stream of thought, as if being occupied meant being protected. But here in the open quiet, nothing felt unsafe. The emptiness didn't collapse inward. It held. That felt important. The body leaned back, supported by the chair without effort. The floor stayed firm beneath the feet. The walls remained where they were. Structure hadn't disappeared just because something had been removed. Space, it turned out, wasn't fragile. It was resilient. Fear had warned that emptiness would lead to confusion, to drifting, to being lost without direction. But what it actually offered was rest from constant orientation. There was no need to decide where to go next. No need to define the moment. Nothing needed to be named. The breath slowed further. Inhale, exhale. Each one complete without needing to lead anywhere else. Time felt less like a line and more like a wide field. This was what fear had been afraid of all along. Not loss, but groundlessness. And yet the groundlessness wasn't chaos. It was openness without edges. In that openness, potential existed without pressure. Not as promise, not as expectation, but as possibility. The kind that doesn't rush to become something specific. The shelf could stay empty tomorrow, or something could be placed there. Either way, the space had done its job. It had made room. That was enough. The night outside deepened, wrapping the house in quiet. No sounds demanded response. No lights called for attention. The body felt settled in a way that didn't come from resolution, but from release. There was nothing to solve, nothing to carry. Fear had always insisted that emptiness needed to be filled quickly before it turned into something frightening. But sitting here, it was clear that emptiness wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. An invitation to stop clinging, to stop rehearsing, to stop defining every moment by what came before or after. The empty space didn't point forward or backward. It simply was. And in that, there was a quiet freedom. The mind rested without trying to understand it. The body softened further, as if it recognized something ancient and familiar. The kind of stillness that doesn't belong to any story. Eventually, the light was turned off. Darkness filled the room easily, without resistance. The empty shelf disappeared from view, but the space it represented remained. Lying down, the body settled into sleep without needing to take anything with it. No plans, no answers, no identity to maintain, just openness. The last feeling before drifting off wasn't fear or hope. It was trust. Not in what would come next, but in the space that allowed whatever came to arrive naturally. Nothing was missing. Nothing needed to be added. The emptiness held everything. And that was where rest finally found its way in. Forgiveness is often imagined as effort, as something you have to work toward, practice, repeat. Something that takes strength, discipline, and intention. Something you do. But sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive that way at all. Sometimes it happens the way a flower drops a petal, quietly, without asking, without force. That afternoon, the window was open just enough to let air move through the room, not a strong breeze, just the kind that shifts papers, slightly lifts a corner of a curtain, then passes on. A plant sat on the table near the window. It had been there for a long time, not carefully chosen, just something that had survived moves, seasons, periods of neglect. One petal lay on the table beneath it, pale, soft, intact. It hadn't been torn off. It hadn't been pulled. It had simply reached the moment when holding on was no longer necessary. That image stayed longer than expected. Earlier that day, anger had been present, but faint, more like a residue than a flame. The sharp edges had dulled, but the memory was still there. A disappointment, a moment of hurt that had never really been resolved. Nothing dramatic had happened recently. No new conflict, no apology, no conversation to reopen the wound. And yet the feeling remained like a low hum in the background. The mind had tried to work on it before, tried to understand, to explain, to justify, to forgive properly. None of that had worked. Sitting there now, the petal drew attention without effort. It hadn't fallen because the plant gave up. It hadn't fallen because something went wrong. It had fallen because it was done being part of that stage of growth. Forgiveness doesn't always come from understanding. Sometimes it comes from timing. The room was still. The afternoon light softened the edges of everything. Dust floated slowly in the air. The memory returned again, but differently this time. Less sharp, less personal, like a story that had already been told enough times. There was a realization, quiet, almost surprising. The anger wasn't being held tightly anymore. Not because a decision had been made, but because the grip had loosened on its own. That felt unfamiliar. So much effort had gone into trying to forgive, trying to let go, trying to be the bigger person, trying to move on. But the petal hadn't tried. It had simply fallen when the connection no longer served a purpose. The body noticed the same thing happening internally. A soft release. Not all at once. Not dramatic. Just a sense that the weight wasn't being carried as deliberately as before. The anger hadn't been pushed away. It hadn't been argued with. It had just lost relevance. The thought arose gently, maybe forgiveness doesn't need to be heavy. That idea felt almost wrong, like cheating, like skipping steps. Forgiveness is supposed to be hard, isn't it? Supposed to require effort, courage, work. But maybe that belief had been part of the struggle. The petal remained on the table. No one rushed to remove it. It wasn't clutter. It wasn't mess. It was just there. The relationship in question felt similar now. Not fixed. Not perfect. Just present, no longer demanding resolution every time it came to mind. There was no urge to reach out. No urge to withdraw further either. The space between felt neutral. That neutrality felt like peace, not the bright kind, but the quiet kind that doesn't need confirmation. Forgiveness didn't announce itself. It didn't say, "Now you are free." It simply stopped asking for attention. The air shifted again. The curtain moved. Another petal trembled slightly on the plant still attached. It would fall later. Or it wouldn't. Either way, there was no rush. The mind returned to the rest of the day. Ordinary things, tasks, small decisions. None of them felt colored by the old anger. That absence was noticeable. Forgiveness hadn't arrived with certainty. It hadn't closed the book. It hadn't tied anything up neatly. It had arrived the way petals fall. Naturally. Without force. Without needing permission. And for the first time, that felt like enough. As evening moved closer, the light in the room changed. The sharp edges of the afternoon softened. Colors lost a bit of contrast. The plant by the window looked calmer, somehow less defined, more at ease with the dimming. The petal was still on the table. It hadn't been touched. No decision had been made about it. It didn't feel like something that needed to be cleaned up or put away. It belonged there for now. There was a subtle difference between letting go and forcing release. Forcing always comes with tension, with effort, with the quiet fear that if you don't keep pushing, something will snap back into place. Letting go when it's real doesn't feel like work. It feels like noticing your hand has already opened. The anger that once felt so present now appeared only occasionally, like a memory passing through. When it did, it didn't demand action. It didn't pull the body forward. It came paused and moved on. That was new. Before, forgiveness had felt like something to do. A process, a task, something that required the right mindset and the right timing. It had always carried a sense of obligation. But this felt different. Nothing had been forgiven on purpose. No statement had been made internally. No rule had been followed. The grip had simply loosened. The petal didn't fall because the plant decided to be generous. It fell because it was no longer needed where it had been. Holding on had stopped serving its role. Forgiveness can work the same way, not as a moral achievement, not as a declaration, but as a natural response when holding on no longer makes sense to the body or the mind. The memory that once carried heat now felt distant, like something seen through glass. Still visible, still real, but no longer sharp enough to cut. That didn't mean the past was erased. It meant the past had been placed where it belonged. There was no rush to feel complete, no urge to check whether forgiveness was finished or correct. Those questions didn't matter anymore. The relationship, whatever shape it now had, existed without pressure. It didn't need to be repaired tonight. It didn't need to be defined. Some things don't resolve. They soften. The room grew quieter as night settled in. The plant stood still. The petal remained where it had fallen. There was something comforting in the ordinariness of it all. Nothing sacred, nothing dramatic. Just a moment where nothing needed to be carried. Forgiveness, it turned out, didn't require effort when it was ready. And when it wasn't ready, no amount of effort could force it. It arrived when it arrived. Like a petal letting go of the stem when the season shifts. No resistance, no ceremony. Just gravity doing what it always does. The night continued. The room darkened further. The plant rested in the quiet, and the petals stayed there, soft, complete, and already part of the ground it would one day return to. Nothing more needed to happen. Nothing needed to be held. Everything was already allowed to rest. They didn't realize how harsh their inner voice was until the room got quiet. It was late. The bedroom was dim lit only by a small lamp on the nightstand. A ceiling fan turned overhead with a soft, steady whir, and the clock on the wall clicked in an unhurried rhythm as if time had nowhere else to be. They stood near the foot of the bed, pulling the comforter smooth with both hands. The gesture was simple, familiar, a small act of order at the end of a long day. And still the voice showed up. You didn't do enough today. You should have handled that better. Why are you like this? It wasn't loud. It never was. It sounded normal, almost responsible. Like it was trying to keep them sharp, keep them improving, keep them from falling behind. For years they had confused that voice with motivation. They folded a corner of the blanket, then adjusted it again, not because it needed it, but because their hands wanted something to do. Busy hands made it easier not to feel. The day had been ordinary on the surface. Work errands, a few messages, a couple of small disappointments. Nothing worth telling someone about, but inside it had been heavy. Heavy in the way that comes from carrying yourself all day, from keeping your face composed, from acting like everything is fine, even when you're tired of being the one who handles it. They turned off the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed. The darkness softened the room. Shapes blurred. The fan kept turning steady, dependable. They took off their socks, then paused, noticing a strange tightness in their chest. Not panic, not sadness exactly, just a subtle ache that had been building for a while. They lay back and stared at the ceiling. The voice returned quieter now, but still present. You're behind. You're not as strong as you should be. Other people don't struggle with this. The thoughts arrived with the confidence of habit. They didn't ask permission, they didn't wait to be invited, and then out of nowhere, a memory surfaced. Not a big memory, just a small one. Being younger, sitting across from someone at a cheap diner, both of them nervous, both of them pretending not to be. The way the air felt charged and tender at the same time. The way they listened closely, as if every word mattered. First love. Not perfect love, not wise love, but earnest love. The kind that pays attention. The kind that cares how you're doing. The kind that notices when you're quiet and asks softly, "What's going on?" They hadn't thought about that in years, but the feeling of it, of being treated gently like you mattered, was still easy to recognize. Lying there, they realized something that made their throat tighten slightly. They would never speak to a first love the way they spoke to themselves. They would never say, "You're not enough." They would never say, "Why can't you be better?" They would never say, "You're a problem to fix." They would have been careful, patient, kind even when they didn't know what to do. So why did they believe they deserved less? They turned onto their side and pulled the blanket up to their chest. The fabric was warm, familiar. Their hand rested on top of it, fingers relaxed. For a moment they tried something different. Not an affirmation, not a forced positive thought, just a softer tone. "You had a long day." The sentence felt almost embarrassing, too gentle, too forgiving. The inner voice tried to fight back. "So what? Everyone has long days." But the softer voice stayed. "Yeah, and you're still allowed to be tired." The words weren't dramatic. They didn't solve anything. But they created a small opening, like cracking a window in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. They noticed their breathing shift almost immediately. The inhale deepened. The exhale lengthened. The body responded to kindness faster than the mind did. They placed a hand lightly over their chest, feeling the steady beat underneath. The warmth of their palms spread into the fabric of the blanket. It wasn't a big gesture, just a small sign of being on their own side. They stayed there listening to the fan, the clock, the quiet. And the harsh voice, for once, didn't have the whole room. They stayed awake a little longer than usual. Not because their mind was racing, but because something inside them was settling. Like snow falling after a long day of wind. Quiet, slow, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying attention. Their hand was still resting on their chest. The warmth there felt steady, reassuring in a way that didn't ask questions. The fan continued its soft rotation above the sound, blending with the rhythm of their breathing. They thought about how love begins. Not the kind that comes later, shaped by experience and caution, but the kind that comes first. The kind that listens closely, that leans in, that wants to understand, not correct. First love doesn't arrive with advice. It arrives with curiosity. It doesn't say, "You should be different." It says, "Tell me more." Somewhere along the way, they had lost that tone with themselves, replaced it with urgency, with pressure, with the belief that kindness would make them weak or complacent. But lying here now, they could feel how wrong that had been. Harshness hadn't made them stronger. It had just made them tired. They remembered small moments from that early love. The way they noticed changes in each other. The way concern showed up before judgment. The way care was offered freely without being earned. They had never expected perfection from someone they loved. They had expected honesty, presence, effort. Why had the standard changed when it came to themselves? They shifted slightly under the blanket, getting more comfortable. The ache in their chest had softened, spreading out instead of pressing inward. It felt like relief, but quieter than they'd imagined. They tried another gentle thought, just to see what would happen. "You're doing the best you can with what you have right now." The sentence didn't feel dramatic. It felt factual. The inner critic stirred less forcefully this time. "That sounds like an excuse." And then something else answered back, calm, steady. "No. It sounds like understanding." Understanding didn't erase responsibility. It didn't remove the desire to grow. It just made room for rest. They realized then that loving yourself like a first love didn't mean constant self-praise or blind optimism. It meant staying on your own side when things were messy. It meant speaking gently when you were already hurting. It meant not abandoning yourself in moments of disappointment. Love, they were learning, was less about intensity and more about consistency. A softer word at the end of the day. A pause before self-criticism. A hand on the chest instead of another demand. These weren't grand gestures, but they changed the tone of everything. Their breathing slowed further, each inhale filling the chest easily. Each exhale releasing what didn't need to be carried into sleep. The room felt safe, familiar, enough. They didn't suddenly feel healed. They didn't feel fixed or complete in any final way. They felt accompanied, and that was new. Tomorrow the old voice might return. The habits might resurface. They knew that. Patterns don't disappear overnight. But now, there was another voice too. One that noticed. One that stayed. One that didn't leave when things felt unfinished. As their eyes grew heavier, a simple understanding settled in without effort. They didn't need to become someone else to be worthy of care. They didn't need to earn their own affection. They didn't need to wait until they were better to be loved. they had been worthy all along. Like a first love, not because they were perfect, but because they were here. The fan hummed, the clock ticked on, and wrapped in the quiet, they let themselves rest, held at last by their own gentleness. The bowl was clean and completely empty. It sat on the table like it was waiting for something, but not impatiently. Just available. A simple ceramic bowl slightly chipped on the rim, the kind you don't replace because it still works and somehow feels familiar in the hand. The person had taken it out without thinking. Dinner had been the plan. Something easy, something warm, something that would make the body feel taken care of. But the evening had gone the way it often did. A few messages, a small task that turned into another task, a quick check of something that turned into 30 minutes of reading and comparing and thinking. The mind stayed busy jumping from one thing to the next, collecting information like it was collecting safety. By the time the person stood in the kitchen, the hunger was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't just hunger in the stomach. It was a hunger in the chest, too. A hunger to feel settled, to feel done, to feel like nothing else was waiting. The bowl sat there empty. The person opened the refrigerator and stared. Not because there wasn't food, but because every option came with more thinking, more decisions, more steps. The mind was tired of choices. A bag of salad, leftovers in a container, eggs, a half-used jar of sauce. The fridge light made everything look slightly unreal, like a list of things to manage instead of things to eat. The door closed again. The person leaned against the counter and exhaled. There was a familiar story that rose up at moments like this. You should be doing more. Not more in the kitchen, more in life. More progress, more improvement. More proof that you were on track. Even rest had to be productive. Even meals had to be optimized. The bowl waited. The person poured a glass of water and took a sip. The coolness helped a little, but the mind kept moving. Thoughts about tomorrow. About something that might go wrong. About something that hadn't been said. About what should be different. Overthinking can feel like filling yourself up, but it's a strange kind of fullness. It's heavy without being nourishing. It's like eating air and expecting to feel satisfied. The person sat down at the table anyway, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting near the empty bowl. The lamp above the table cast a soft pool of light, leaving the corners of the kitchen in shadow. The room was quiet. Not perfectly silent, but quiet enough to hear the small things, the hum of the fridge, the faint creak of the building settling a distant car passing outside. The bowl looked almost too empty. The mind didn't like emptiness. It treated it like a problem, a gap that needed to be filled. If there was space, it rushed to occupy it with plans, worries, lists, memories. Anything was better than nothing, it believed. But the person stayed there looking at the bowl and felt something else. A small truth. A bowl has to be empty to receive anything. If it's already full, nothing new fits. Not soup, not rice, not something warm that actually feeds you. If you keep pouring into a full bowl, it just spills over messy and wasted. The person let that sink in slowly. Not as a quote, not as a lesson, just as an obvious fact. The mind had been acting like a bowl that refused to be empty. It stayed filled with thoughts, filled with worry, filled with the effort to control things that couldn't be controlled. It had become a habit, filling, without noticing that none of it was nourishing. The person reached out and touched the rim of the bowl. The ceramic was cool and smooth. The chip on the edge caught the fingertip. A small imperfection, familiar and real. There was a thought that came up soft but persistent. If I stop thinking, I'll fall behind. That thought had been around for years. It had helped the person study, work, push through difficult times. It had created momentum when life felt uncertain. In that sense, it had done its job. But tonight, sitting at the table with an empty bowl, it felt like an old rule that didn't fit anymore. Like wearing a coat in summer. Like gripping a jar too hard. Like staring at a spinning compass and calling it direction. The body was tired. Not lazy, not weak. Just tired. And tiredness doesn't need to be argued with. The person didn't try to empty the mind completely. That wasn't the goal. The goal was simpler, to allow a little space. A small pause where nothing had to be solved. The shoulders dropped slightly. The breath moved deeper. The hands rested open beside the empty bowl. And in that brief openness, the person realized something surprising. The emptiness wasn't scary. It was gentle. It was the first moment all day that didn't ask for more. The person stood up and opened the fridge again, but this time without the pressure to choose perfectly. The hand reached for the leftovers container, simple and obvious. The microwave beeped softly. The spoon clinked against the bowl. Food went in. The bowl accepted it easily. And something inside the person accepted it too. Not perfection. Not a fully solved life. Just dinner. Just warmth. Just one small thing placed into an empty space. The bowl was no longer empty. Steam rose gently from the food, carrying a simple, familiar smell. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive. Just something warm enough to be felt before it was tasted. The spoon rested inside the bowl handle, tilted slightly to one side, like it had found a comfortable place to wait. The person sat back down at the table and paused. Not out of ritual, not out of gratitude, just because the body wasn't in a hurry anymore. The first bite was taken slowly. The food didn't change anything dramatic. It didn't solve the day. It didn't erase the thoughts waiting for tomorrow. But it landed. It did what food is meant to do. It nourished quietly and directly. There was a subtle relief in that. So much of the day had been about adding things more, thinking, more planning, more reacting. Adding had felt responsible, necessary. But sitting there now, the person noticed how different this felt. This wasn't adding. This was receiving. The mind still chimed in, of course. It mentioned emails, deadlines, things that hadn't been finished. The old urge to multitask rose briefly, suggesting that eating could happen faster alongside something else. But the body didn't follow. It stayed with the bowl, with the spoon, with the simple act of being fed. That was new. not revolutionary, just new enough to be noticed. The emptiness from earlier hadn't been a failure. It had been a condition, a requirement. Without that pause, without that moment of not filling every space with thought, this meal would have been rushed, barely tasted, forgotten. The person realized then how often they'd treated emptiness as something to escape. Silence, pauses, not knowing what to do next. All of it had been met with noise, distraction, mental activity, as if space itself were dangerous. But space was what allowed this moment to exist. The bowl, now partly full and partly empty again as food was eaten, showed that clearly. It moved naturally between states, empty enough to receive, full enough to satisfy, then empty again without drama. The mind had tried to stay full all the time, full of plans, full of opinions, full of worry. No wonder it felt heavy. Halfway through the meal, the person noticed something else. The body felt calmer than it had earlier. The chest wasn't tight. The jaw wasn't clenched. The nervous system, finally getting what it needed, began to soften on its own. This was the part that was easy to miss. Letting go didn't happen through effort. It happened through allowing. Allowing hunger to be felt. Allowing the bowl to be empty. Allowing something simple to come in without judgment. The person ate the rest of the food without rushing. When the bowl was empty again, it felt complete, not lacking. The spoon was set down. The table was quiet. Outside, night had fully arrived. The window reflected the soft glow of the kitchen light. The world beyond it carried on, busy and complex, but it felt distant for now. The bowl was rinsed and placed in the drying rack. Water ran over it, clean and unremarkable. The chip on the rim caught the light briefly, then disappeared into shadow. Standing there, hands resting on the counter, the person felt a gentle understanding settle in. Peace wasn't about having more. It wasn't about filling every gap with certainty or control. It was about knowing when to stop adding. The mind would fill again tomorrow. That was its nature. Thoughts would come, worries would appear, plans would be made. None of that needed to be fought. But now, there was another option available. When things felt too full, too loud, too tight, too crowded, inside the person could remember the bowl, remember that emptiness wasn't a problem to fix. It was an invitation. An empty bowl doesn't mean something is missing. It means something can arrive. The light over the sink was turned off. The kitchen dimmed. The apartment settled into its nighttime quiet. The body moved toward rest without being told. Nothing else needed to be filled tonight. The bowl had done its job, and so had the pause that came before it. It didn't happen with a big moment. No shouting, no accident, just a short message on a phone screen. "We need to talk." That was it. The phone rested on the passenger seat, face up, glowing softly in the dark. The car was parked in the driveway, engine off, the porch light casting a small yellow circle onto the hood. Somewhere nearby, insects filled the night with their steady, uneven sound. The kind of sound you don't notice until everything else goes quiet. The body reacted before the mind could catch up. Shoulders tightened, jaw locked, breath shortened. Nothing bad had actually happened yet. There was no argument, no explanation, no outcome. Just those 4 words. And still the chest felt like it had been nudged from the inside, as if something sharp had landed there. Pain arrived first. Fast, honest, simple. And then came everything else. What did it mean? Was this about yesterday? Did I say the wrong thing? What if this changes everything? What if I can't fix it? The mind began working immediately, like it always does. Running scenarios, replaying conversations, drafting replies that wouldn't be sent. Preparing defenses for arguments that hadn't happened. It felt productive, responsible, necessary. But the body didn't feel helped. The heart beat faster. The hands gripped the steering wheel, even though the car wasn't moving. The breath stayed high, shallow, stuck near the collarbone. A familiar pressure settled behind the eyes. There was the original pain, the sting of uncertainty. And then there was the added weight, the fear layered on top of it. Most people don't notice the difference. It all feels like one solid block of suffering. But if you slow down just enough, you can sense the split. The first arrow lands, and then we pick up the second one ourselves. The second arrow is made of imagination, of future stories, of what if, and I should have, and this always happens. The car remained still. The night didn't change. The message stayed the same. At some point, the hands loosened without being told to. The grip softened, not because the situation improved, but because the muscles grew tired of holding so tightly. The jaw unclenched just a little. Air slipped in deeper than before. There was a quiet noticing. This hurts. And I'm making it hurt more. Not as a judgment, not as a failure, just an observation like noticing rain hitting the windshield. The fear wasn't coming from the message anymore. It was coming from everything being added to it. The body doesn't understand timelines. It reacts to what feels present. When the mind projects a future argument, a future loss, a future rejection, the nervous system treats it like it's already happening. So the heart races, the stomach knots, the shoulders brace for impact, all in response to something that hasn't arrived. The porch light flickered slightly as a moth passed through its glow. Somewhere, a neighbor's door closed softly. Ordinary sounds. Normal life continuing, untouched by the drama playing inside one parked car. There was a small, almost forgettable moment of choice. Not a heroic one. Not a spiritual one. Just this: do I keep firing the second arrow? The phone buzzed again. Not a message, just a notification from some app updating in the background. The screen lit up, then dimmed. The heart jumped anyway. Another arrow, almost fired. Instead, the phone was turned face down. Not thrown, not hidden. Just gently flipped, like closing a book you can come back to later. The pain didn't disappear. The uncertainty was still there. That part couldn't be erased. But something else shifted. The mind didn't stop producing thoughts. It rarely does. But they slowed, stretched out, left small gaps between them. In those gaps, the body began to speak more clearly. The ache in the chest wasn't danger. It was discomfort. The tightness wasn't collapse. It was resistance. The fear wasn't prophecy. It was a signal. Fear, at its core, tries to protect. It evolved to help humans survive. It sharpens attention. It prepares the body to respond. But when it's left running without a real threat to meet, it turns inward, starts attacking shadows. The second arrow doesn't come from malice. It comes from wanting control. If I think enough, I'll be ready. If I worry enough, I won't be surprised. If I stay tense, nothing can sneak up on me. But the cost is paid immediately in the body. The seat felt firmer now. The back pressed into it more fully. Breath dropped lower, reaching the belly for the first time since the message arrived. Not calm, just less clenched. There was still a conversation waiting somewhere in the future. That hadn't changed, but right now there was only a quiet driveway, a resting car, and a body learning slowly that it didn't need to fight an enemy that hadn't shown up. The second arrow lay unused for the moment, not destroyed, just set down. The pain didn't need to be solved to be understood. That realization didn't arrive as a sentence. It came as a physical shift, the way the chest rose a little more evenly, the way the shoulders stopped hovering near the ears, the way the night air felt cooler once the window was cracked open an inch. Fear often feels urgent, like something must be done immediately. Say something, fix something, prepare something. But urgency is not the same as truth. The body can feel danger even when there is only uncertainty. And uncertainty left unexplained is one of the mind's favorite places to create stories. The first arrow had already landed. There was no arguing with that. A message like that would make almost anyone flinch. That part was human, natural, honest. What came next was optional. The mind kept offering more arrows. You're about to lose something. This is going to hurt. You won't be able to handle it. Each thought carried an image, a future scene, a tone of voice, a look on someone's face that hadn't happened yet. The nervous system responded to each one as if it were real. It's easy to confuse preparation with protection. But preparation that has no object turns into tension. Protection without clarity turns into self-harm. Fear itself isn't the enemy. It's information. Raw data. A signal that something matters. That there is attachment, care, vulnerability. The problem begins when fear is treated as a verdict. When the body says, something is unknown, and the mind replies, something is wrong. That's when the second arrow flies. The porch light still glowed. The same moth circled it, stubborn and soft. The driveway hadn't changed. The night was steady, almost indifferent. It didn't confirm the fear. It didn't deny it either. There was a subtle learning happening beneath thought. Nothing terrible is happening right now. Not as a mantra, not as reassurance, just as a fact. Right now there was sitting, breathing, a quiet car, a phone placed face down, a future conversation that existed only as imagination. Fear hates empty space. It rushes to fill gaps with conclusions. But empty space is where understanding grows. Understanding doesn't arrive as answers. It arrives as seeing more clearly, seeing that pain doesn't require panic, seeing that uncertainty doesn't equal catastrophe, seeing that the body can feel discomfort without being in danger. The first arrow brings sensation. The second arrow brings suffering. And the second arrow requires effort. Effort to replay, effort to project, effort to brace. When that effort softens even slightly, suffering loses fuel. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It felt less like a monster and more like a tight knot. Less like an attack and more like a question. Questions don't need to be fought. They need space. At some point, the door of the house opened. Light spilled out briefly, then narrowed as the door closed again. Ordinary movement. Ordinary life. Someone inside probably thinking about something completely unrelated. It was a quiet reminder, not everything is about this moment. Not everything is waiting to collapse. Impermanence doesn't only apply to good things ending. It also applies to fear. Fear rises, fear peaks, fear passes, unless we hold it still with stories. The second arrow tries to freeze the moment, to lock the body into a future that hasn't happened, to keep the nervous system on alert long after the threat has dissolved. But fear, like everything else, is a moving thing. The breath proved that. In, out. Each breath was slightly different from the one before it. Longer, shorter, deeper, shallower. Change was already happening without permission. Understanding doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like humility, like realizing you don't need to be in charge of every outcome. That not knowing is not a failure of character. It's simply part of being alive. The phone remained silent. The conversation still hadn't happened. Nothing had been resolved. And yet something important had. The second arrow was no longer in the air. Not because fear had disappeared, but because it was no longer being fed, no longer sharpened, no longer launched again and again at the same wound. Pain can exist without fear attached to it. Uncertainty can exist without panic layered on top. That doesn't make you passive. It makes you present. Eventually, the car door opened. The night air wrapped around warm skin. Feet touched the ground. Gravel shifted under weight. Each step toward the door was unremarkable, and that was the point. Life doesn't pause while we're afraid. It keeps moving quietly, inviting us to move with it. The message would be answered later. The conversation would happen when it happened. For now, the body was no longer at war with a future that hadn't arrived. The first arrow had landed. The second one had been set down. And in that small, ordinary choice, there was less suffering, not because anything was fixed, but because something was finally understood. There are days when anger doesn't explode. It just sits there quiet and dense, like something heavy you've been carrying without noticing how long it's been in your hands. That afternoon, the yard was unusually still. No music from the neighbor's house. No kids riding bikes past the fence. Just the soft hum of insects and the faint click of a porch light turning on as the sky dimmed. The hose was already uncoiled, lying in a loose curve across the grass, warm from the sun. The person stood barefoot on the patio, watering a tree near the edge of the yard. It wasn't a tree anyone would brag about. The trunk was thick but uneven. The bark was cracked and dark in places, like it had survived something rough a long time ago. Some branches grew awkwardly sideways. Others seemed dead, reaching nowhere in particular. It was the kind of tree most people would have cut down already. As the water soaked into the dirt, the mind wandered back to the day. A meeting that had ended with a comment that shouldn't have mattered, but did. A tone that lingered longer than the words themselves. A quiet dismissal wrapped in professionalism, sharp enough to sting, but not sharp enough to confront directly. The body had reacted before the mind could name it. Tight shoulders. A jaw that stayed clenched hours later. A chest that felt slightly compressed, like it was holding something in. Anger has a way of pretending it's useful. It tells you it's there to protect you, to make sure you're not overlooked, to make sure people don't get away with things. Standing there, hose in hand, that story felt familiar. The water darkened the soil around the tree's roots. It soaked in slowly, unevenly, as if the ground itself was tired. A few drops splashed onto bare toes, cool against warm skin. The sound was steady, almost boring. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. And then the thought appeared simple and uninvited. This tree doesn't compete with anything. It doesn't try to grow straighter than the others. It doesn't push higher than the fence. It doesn't seem interested in proving that it deserves the space it takes up. It just stands there. The person remembered something once read long ago about a tree like this. A tree considered useless because its wood was twisted and soft, not good for building anything valuable. Because it couldn't be easily shaped into furniture or tools, no one bothered cutting it down. And because no one cut it down, it lived out its full life. The irony of it settled in quietly. All day long, the anger had been fueled by a need to be taken seriously, to be respected, to not be dismissed. The mind kept replaying alternate versions of the conversation. Smarter responses, sharper comebacks. Ways to win the moment retroactively. But none of that had brought relief. It had only kept the body tense, alert, on guard. The hose slipped slightly in the hand. Water arced off course, hitting the side of the trunk. The bark absorbed it without complaint. The realization wasn't grand. It didn't arrive like wisdom usually does in movies. It came as a quiet question. What if I don't need to win this? Not because the other person deserves forgiveness. Not because what happened was okay. But because carrying this heat all evening is costing me more than it's costing them. Anger, when held too long, doesn't stay pointed outward. It leaks inward. It tightens the muscles, speeds up the heart, makes rest feel unsafe, like letting go would mean losing something important. The tree didn't seem to be guarding anything. It wasn't tense. It wasn't bracing. It had scars, yes. Old breaks, uneven growth, signs of storms that had come and gone. But it wasn't reliving them. The water pooled briefly at the base before sinking in. The hose was turned down slightly, the pressure reduced. The sound softened. there was a subtle shift in the body, almost imperceptible. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The breath moved lower, deeper, without instruction. The jaw unclenched on its own. No decision was made to forgive. No promise to be the bigger person. Just a recognition that staying angry was a kind of constant effort. Like holding your arms up all day and calling it strength. The tree stood there imperfect and unremarkable, and somehow untouched by the need to justify itself. And for a moment, standing barefoot on cooling concrete, it felt possible to stand the same way. Not giving up, not agreeing, just not fighting what didn't need to be fought anymore. The water kept flowing steady and quiet as the light faded further, and the evening settled in, unfinished, but no longer burning. The sky had gone darker by the time the watering was done. Not night yet, but that in-between hour when shapes soften and the day stops demanding explanations. The hose was turned off. Water drained slowly from the line, dripping a few last times onto the concrete before going still. The person didn't rush inside. There was a habit of replaying things at this hour. Not loudly, more like a low background noise. The mind checking the same corner again just to see if anything had changed, just to make sure no advantage had been missed. But something about standing near that tree made the checking feel unnecessary. Up close, the trunk showed more detail, places where the bark had split and healed over. A knot where a branch must have broken off years ago. None of it was hidden. None of it was fixed either. It was simply there, exposed, weathered, and still standing. There was a strange relief in that. So much of the anger from earlier had been about being seen the wrong way, about feeling reduced to a moment, a mistake, a tone. The urge to correct the record had been strong, to explain, to prove, to make sure the story told about you was accurate. But the tree wasn't telling a story. It wasn't clarifying anything. It wasn't defending its shape. It had survived by being exactly what it was. A memory surfaced, not of the meeting itself, but of the body afterward. Sitting at the desk, pretending to focus, while something tight and restless paced inside the chest. The cost of that kind of vigilance had never been questioned. It was just assumed to be part of being competent, part of caring. Standing there now, it felt clearer how expensive that habit really was. Forgiveness is often talked about like a moral achievement. Something you grant when you've processed everything properly, when you've reached a higher ground. But what if it's simpler than that? What if forgiveness sometimes is just the decision to stop bleeding energy into a situation that no longer deserves your nervous system? The thought didn't demand agreement. It didn't even feel noble. It felt practical. The breeze picked up slightly, moving the leaves. A few of them brushed against each other, dry and soft. The sound was small, almost private. Nothing to pay attention to unless you were already standing still. The person noticed their hands. They were no longer gripping anything, just hanging at their sides, loose. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Earlier, anger had felt like readiness. Now it was obvious how much it had been a kind of bracing. The tree hadn't braced for anything today. It had taken the sun, the heat, the water, the quiet. And tomorrow, it would take whatever came next. It didn't mean it wouldn't be damaged again. It didn't mean storms wouldn't return. It only meant that standing in constant resistance wasn't its way of surviving. The person leaned slightly against the porch railing, feeling its cool edge against the back of the legs. There was no urge to rehearse the conversation anymore. No need to draft the perfect response that would never be delivered. Not because the other person had been understood. Not because the hurt had been erased. But because continuing to carry it didn't feel like strength anymore. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from always needing to be right, from always needing to be seen clearly. It keeps the mind alert and the body tight even when nothing is happening. The tree had escaped that exhaustion by being in a way unuseful, not impressive enough to be harvested, not straight enough to be valuable, not productive enough to compete. And because of that, it had been left alone. The idea settled gently. Maybe peace doesn't come from winning space, but from becoming a place no one needs to cut into. Inside the house, a light turned on automatically as the sun dropped lower. The glow spilled out onto the patio, warm and unassuming. The evening had moved on without asking permission. The person took one last look at the tree. It wasn't inspiring. It wasn't symbolic in any dramatic way. It was just there doing nothing in particular, and somehow that was enough. The anger from earlier wasn't gone. It didn't need to be. It had simply loosened its grip, no longer steering the body, no longer demanding a response. There would be other moments like this, other comments, other dismissals, other sparks. That much was certain. But for now there was a choice not to add more fuel, not to swing the axe inward, not to keep sharpening a blade that would only cut the hand holding it. The door was left open as the person stepped inside. The evening air followed, cool and calm, mixing with the quiet of the house. Outside, the tree stood where it always had, uneven, scarred, unbothered. And inside, something had learned how to stand a little more like that. There's a small park not far from where he lives. Nothing special. A short walking path, a couple of benches, a playground that's usually empty during the week. He ends up there one evening without planning to. Just a long day, a wrong turn, and the quiet felt easier than going straight home. He sits on a bench with a paper cup of coffee that's already gone lukewarm. The air smells like damp grass and old leaves. Somewhere behind him, a dog barks once and then settles. It's one of those in-between hours when people are heading home but haven't quite arrived yet. Across from the bench is a large tree. Thick trunk, wide branches. Not pretty in a dramatic way. No flowers, no bright color, just there. Its branches spread out unevenly, casting a wide patch of shade even though the sun is already dropping. He notices the tree because it looks in a strange way inefficient. The trunk bends slightly to one side. The branches don't grow straight up like they're supposed to. Some of them twist outward almost awkwardly. It doesn't look like the kind of tree you'd choose for lumber. Too crooked, too unpredictable. If someone were judging it by usefulness, they'd probably shake their head and move on. He thinks about how often he's felt exactly like that. At work, he's reliable but never impressive. He does his part, finishes his tasks, doesn't cause trouble. But he's not the one people point to when promotions come up. Not the one with bold ideas or sharp edges. Just steady, quiet, easy to overlook. He's been called nice more times than he can count. Helpful, dependable. And somehow those words have started to sound like polite ways of saying unnecessary. He breaks off a small piece of the coffee cup lid, rolling it between his fingers. The thought slips in uninvited, as thoughts often do. Maybe I should have been more something, louder, smarter, more driven, more useful. A couple walks past with a stroller. They slow down near the tree and stop. The woman shifts the stroller slightly so the baby is fully in the shade. The man leans against the trunk, stretching his back for a moment, eyes closed. Neither of them looks at the tree the way he did. They don't seem to evaluate it at all. They just use what's already there. The tree doesn't do anything dramatic. It doesn't try to impress them. It doesn't straighten itself or grow taller. It simply stands offering shade without asking who deserves it. He feels something loosen in his chest just a little. There's an old idea he once heard, maybe in a book, maybe from a friend, about a tree that was considered useless because its wood couldn't be cut into clean boards. Too twisted, too soft, too irregular. So it was left alone. And because it was left alone, it grew large, wide. It lived long enough to become a place where people rested, talked, slept beneath its branches. Its uselessness was exactly what saved it. He hadn't thought about that story in years, but sitting here now, it feels closer than it ever did before. What if the parts of him that didn't fit neatly into expectations weren't flaws? What if being overlooked had quietly protected something in him? What if not being chosen again and again had given him space to grow in directions no one was measuring? A breeze moves through the branches above him. Leaves rustle, not loudly, just enough to be noticed if you're paying attention. The sound isn't trying to calm anyone. It's just happening. He realizes he's been holding his shoulders tight. He lets them drop. No big decision. No inner speech about self-acceptance. Just a physical release, like setting down a bag he forgot he was carrying. For so long he's believed that worth had to be proven. That value came from being picked, praised, needed in obvious ways. That if he wasn't useful in the right way, something must be missing. But the tree hasn't earned its place here by trying harder. It hasn't added anything. It hasn't changed itself to match a plan. It simply grew according to its own shape. He watches the shadows stretch longer on the ground. The bench cools under him. The coffee cup is empty now, light in his hand. Maybe the problem was never that he lacked something. Maybe he's been carrying expectations that were never his to begin with. He stands up slowly, not because he's reached a conclusion, but because the moment feels finished. As he walks away, he doesn't look back at the tree. He doesn't need to. The shade remains doing what it's always done without asking to be called useful. He doesn't go home right away. Instead, he walks the long way around the park, following the path that loops past the playground and back toward the street. The ground is uneven, in places cracked from old roots, pushing up through the pavement. He watches where he steps, not because it's dangerous, but because the habit feels familiar. Paying attention, staying slightly careful. Near the far end of the path, there's another bench, smaller, half hidden behind bushes. No one ever sits there. It's too far from the entrance, too close to the maintenance fence. Not useful. He smiles faintly at the thought. He sits anyway. From here he can see the tree again, but from a different angle. The bend in the trunk looks more pronounced from this side. One branch droops lower than the others, heavy with leaves. It's not symmetrical, not balanced in the way diagrams like to show. And yet it stands. He thinks about all the ways he's tried to straighten himself over the years. The times he spoke up in meetings, even when he didn't have much to say, just so no one would think he was passive. The jobs he took because they sounded impressive, not because they fit. The version of himself he presented on first dates smoother and more confident than he actually felt. None of it was fake exactly, just edited, useful but tiring. There's a quiet sadness in realizing how much energy it takes to keep sanding down your own edges. How often he's mistaken survival for self-improvement. How many things he's learned to carry that were never truly his. A maintenance worker passes by pushing a cart of tools. The wheels rattle briefly, then fade. The park settles back into its soft, ordinary sounds. Nothing is asking him to be better right now. Nothing is watching closely. That's when it lands, not as a thought, but as a feeling. Heavy and gentle at the same time. He doesn't need to add anything. Not another skill, not another explanation, not another version of himself that fits more neatly into someone else's outline. The shape is already here. It always has been. What he's tired of is the extra weight, the labels, the quiet rules he's followed without remembering who set them. The belief that worth is something that arrives later after enough proof has been gathered. The tree doesn't carry proof. It doesn't defend its shape. It doesn't apologize for the way its branches grow. It doesn't compete with the smaller, straighter trees nearby. It simply takes up space season after season, offering what it can by being exactly what it is. He leans back against the bench and lets his head tilt up. The sky has shifted into that pale blue that only shows up for a short time in the evening. Not quite day, not yet night. A few clouds drift by thin and slow. He thinks about how often he's waited for permission to feel okay. Permission to rest. Permission to stop pushing. Permission to be enough without evidence. No one ever handed it to him. Maybe that permission was never something to receive. Maybe it was something to stop asking for. A child runs past chasing a ball, laughing, not looking where he's going. A parent calls out, not sharply, just enough to guide. Life moves around him in small, ordinary ways. No one pauses to evaluate whether he belongs on this bench in this park at this hour. Belonging, he realizes, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just the absence of resistance. He stands again, stretching his legs. His body feels different than it did earlier. Not lighter exactly, just less compressed. Like something inside has been allowed to take up its full width. As he heads toward the exit, he passes under the wide branches one last time. The shade is thinner now, the sun nearly gone, but it's still there, still offered, still unbothered by whether anyone notices. He pauses for a second, not to thank the tree or make a mental note or turn the moment into a lesson, just to stand. Then he keeps walking. The park behind him grows quieter as he reaches the street. Headlights pass. A bus sighs at the corner. The world continues in its usual, imperfect rhythm. And somewhere between the bench and the sidewalk, something simple settles in. He doesn't need to become more. He only needs to stop carrying what isn't him. There are evenings when nothing dramatic happens, yet everything inside still feels crowded. The day ends, the lights get softer. The noise outside fades, but the mind keeps moving. Not fast in a panicked way, more like a low, constant stirring. Thought after thought gently bumping into each other, leaving no empty space behind. It's one of those nights. The kitchen is quiet. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of a clock somewhere in the apartment. A kettle sits on the stove, already warm steam beginning to rise in thin lines. The cup on the counter is clean, waiting. Simple, ordinary. The kind of moment that usually feels calm unless your mind arrives already full. The water is poured slowly, not rushed, not careless. And yet before there's time to stop, the cup reaches the edge. One extra second, one extra tilt of the kettle, and the tea spills over. A thin stream runs down the side of the cup, pooling quietly on the counter. It's not a mess, just enough to notice. There's a pause, a small sigh. Not frustration exactly, more like recognition. The cup was already full. Earlier that evening, there had been a familiar feeling. The sense that something was missing. That calm hadn't quite arrived yet. That maybe one more thought, one more plan, one more mental check-in would finally make things feel settled. So the mind kept pouring, reviewing conversations, replaying moments, imagining tomorrow, imagining next week, imagining how things could go wrong and how they might be fixed ahead of time. None of it felt extreme. It rarely does. Overthinking usually arrives dressed as responsibility, as care, as preparation. But standing there now, looking at the tea slowly spreading across the counter, something becomes clear without needing to be said out loud. You can't add peace to a cup that's already full. The mind works the same way. When it's crowded with worry, even gentle things can overflow. Even quiet moments feel tense. Even rest starts to feel like another task to complete correctly. A towel is grabbed. The spill is wiped without hurry. No sharp movements, no irritation. Just the simple action of cleaning up what happened. The cup is placed back in the center of the counter, still warm, still usable, just no longer being filled. There's a strange relief in stopping, not fixing, not improving, just stopping. The tea is lifted carefully this time, a small sip. The warmth spreads slowly, exactly as it does every other night. Nothing special, nothing profound. And yet something feels different. The mind is still busy. Thoughts haven't disappeared. They're still there, lined up, waiting to speak. But they're no longer being invited to take over the moment. No longer being poured into. There's an old habit most people carry without realizing it. When the mind feels restless, the instinct is to add something. Add understanding, add control, add reassurance, add effort. But rarely does anyone pause to ask whether the container itself is already full. Overthinking doesn't come from having too many thoughts. It comes from continuing to stir when stillness would do. The cup sits quietly now, steam rising, no movement, no overflow, just enough. There's a chair pulled out from the table. The body lowers into it, heavier than expected. Shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, the kind of shift that happens on its own when no one is watching, when nothing is being demanded. Thoughts continue to appear. A reminder about something unfinished, a memory from earlier in the day, a concern that likes to show up at night when there's nothing else competing for attention. But instead of engaging with them, instead of following them down familiar paths, they're allowed to hover, to exist without being acted on, like watching the surface of the tea after it's been stirred. At first, everything moves. Tiny leaves spinning, currents crossing. Then slowly, without effort, it all begins to settle. Not because someone made it stop, but because no one kept stirring. There's no rule here, no instruction to empty the mind, no demand to calm down, just a quiet noticing. The recognition that stillness isn't something you add. It's something that appears when interference ends. The cup doesn't need more tea tonight, and the mind doesn't need more thinking. For now, it's enough to sit, to hold the warmth, to let what's already here be exactly as it is, without asking it to become something else. The tea cools slowly, not all at once, just enough that it no longer demands attention. It sits there doing what warm things naturally do when left alone. No one tells it to cool, no one interferes. Time handles it quietly. The same can't always be said for the mind. Even after the kettle is turned off, even after the spill is cleaned, thoughts have a way of returning. Not aggressively, more like they're checking to see if the door is still open, if there's room to come back in, if this is a moment where they should take charge again. There's a subtle urge to reach for the phone, to scroll, to distract, or the opposite urge to think more deliberately, to solve something, to get ahead of tomorrow while there's still time. But something about the cup sitting there undisturbed makes that urge feel unnecessary. The surface of the tea is smooth now, still. Nothing floating in circles anymore, just a quiet reflection of the kitchen light above. It's not dramatic, it's almost boring. And that's exactly why it works. Most people assume calm should feel like an achievement, like something earned through effort. But real calm often arrives in moments like this, when nothing is being added and nothing is being pushed away. There's a difference between resting and pausing. Pausing still carries tension. It waits. Resting doesn't wait for anything. The body leans back slightly in the chair. The back makes full contact this time. There's a sense of being held by something solid, even if it's just wood and gravity. Breathing adjusts on its own, deeper without being forced, slower without instruction. Thoughts still appear. They always do. a question about the future, a small regret from earlier, a plan that didn't go quite as expected. But instead of pulling the mind along with them, they pass through like background noise, present but no longer in charge. It becomes clear that the problem was never the thoughts themselves. It was the constant adding, the belief that peace needed to be poured in from the outside instead of uncovered by stopping. The cup doesn't get refilled. There's trust in that choice. Trust that what's already there is enough. That this moment doesn't need improvement. That nothing will break if things are left as they are for a while. Outside, a car passes. Headlights sweep briefly across the wall, then disappear. Another reminder of movement happening without participation. The world continues even when no one is managing it. Overthinking often comes from a quiet fear that if the mind stops working, something will be missed. Something will go wrong. Something important will slip through the cracks. But sitting here watching the tea simply exist, another possibility becomes visible. Maybe some things only settle when they're left alone. Maybe clarity doesn't arrive through effort, but through space. There's no need to empty the cup, no need to pour anything out, no need to get it exactly right, just not adding more. The warmth in the hands fades gradually. The cup is set down. There's no rush to finish it, no urgency to move on to the next thing. Time feels less sharp, less demanding. This is often how the mind softens, not through control, but through permission. Permission to stop contributing to the noise. Permission to let the cup remain full without overflowing. The evening continues quietly. Nothing is solved. Nothing is resolved in a dramatic way. And yet something important has shifted. The stirring has stopped. And in that stillness without effort, the mind finds its own balance. Not because it was fixed, but because it was left alone. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.